Well, greetings, imagination connoisseurs. Once again, it is I, your Duke of Dope Discourse, your master of fun and wonder, your viceroy of verisimilitude, your pharaoh of physical media, your archbishop of banterbury, your chancellor of cheerfulness, and, of course, your existential Mr. Rogers, Robert Meyer Burnett, coming at you with Robservations episode number 484. I was going to go on yesterday and I was rudely interrupted by power issues, YouTube issues. There was kind of craziness happening, and I was all upset because I really wanted to jump on the bandwagon to review Star Trek Lower Decks. But instead, I'm not going to. I'm going to talk about it, but I'm not going to necessarily review it. It is what it is. Many people have reviewed the show all over the place. People that are prone to like the secret hideout, the last 12 years of Star Trek, tend to like it. A lot of people were surprised that it wasn't a horrible train wreck. It's interesting. But whatever you think of Star Trek Lower Decks, no one is jumping for joy. No one is saying, oh my God, that was so excellent. And we should be saying that about Star Trek. Star Trek has always been sort of, hit and miss. Remember, there's not a whole lot of love for Star Trek the Motion Picture, even though it's my favorite Star Trek movie. Do I think it's the best? No. It's my favorite. Star Trek has always been spotty at best. And certainly, in terms of people talk about the odd-numbered movies, the even-numbered movies, people say, well, the first two seasons of Next Generation were terrible until Michael Piller came on board. There's always, and was Star Trek ever perfect? Like, there's this, even I, as a lifelong Star Trek fan, I'm surrounded by Star Trek information, whatever. I've been thinking about it. It's basically my religion for most of my life. So I could wax rhapsodic about Star Trek for as long as you want me to. I could talk about Star Trek novels. I could talk about Star Trek comics. I could talk about the Star Trek series. Was all of it perfect? Certainly not. Even the original series, of course, we have the third season. Fred Freiberger comes over and changes it all around, and they have less money to make it. After a letter writing campaign for fans, well, they put it back for another year, but they stick it in a Friday night death spot. So Star Trek has always had a history of being very up and down. And I think that what's really interesting now, what Star Trek has never faced, is now it's being looked at as this franchise. Like, the idea of Star Trek has now become something that's plug and play. We're getting 2 Star Trek animated series. Star Trek Lower Decks, which is aimed more for adults, and then we're getting Star Trek Prodigy, which is aimed at kids. Well, what's strange about all of this to me is that I loved Star Trek as a 5-year-old. I loved the original series. It appealed to 5-year-olds. It appealed to adults. In that sense, Star Trek was magic. And the problem is now, I don't think that the people that are in charge of making Star Trek, especially for the last 12 years, we had J.J. Abrams bringing Star Trek back, and he said in every interview, I was never a Star Trek fan. And yet, you're going to be directing at the time Star Trek '09, the most expensive Star Trek movie ever made. But I'm not a fan. So what we got was a generic, populist, social media version of what Star Trek is. If you ask my mother what she thought of Star Trek, filtered through her sensibility, you'd pretty much get Star Trek '09. We got the broad strokes. We got people imitating characters. Carl Urban, great imitation of DeForest Kelley. But we didn't get something that was really new or true to the franchise. We got a recreation of things that people had already done. Characters other actors had already played. Which was odd because up to that time, Star Trek had always been reinventing itself, moving forward. It never really looked back the way Star Trek '09 did. Let's go back to the beginning and redo Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. Well, what was interesting about the Star Trek franchise as a franchise is even when it went back, in the case of Enterprise, where you went back and you did a prequel series, you still got to meet a bunch of people you didn't know. You still were covering ground that had never been covered before. So from 1966 to 2005, much of the appeal of Star Trek was because it was expanding and growing and adding to its own mythology. Well, what Star Trek 2009 did was it went back and it tried to sort of go back and tell you the story that you already heard before, but in a more modern, in a different way. Unfortunately, the results were very, let's just say, ordinary. And ever since Star Trek '09 has come out, Star Trek has been something we kind of look forward to, but it's not breaking any new ground, which has been unfortunate. And clearly, ever since Star Trek Beyond came out, which, by the way, was not a hit for the studio, they have been looking for ways to change the franchise around. Now, or maybe figure out a way to make... Here's my if you asked my assessment of what they need to do with the Star Trek franchise at Paramount, and surprisingly, it's what they always did with the Star Trek franchise at Paramount, they have to figure out a way to make a movie not for $200 million, but for $100 million. And they need to make a Star Trek movie for $100 million because Star Trek has never traveled foreign. Even as much money as they threw at trying to market it in foreign territories for Star Trek Into Darkness, which was a hideously expensive movie in terms of production and how much it cost to market. This idea that they're trying to... It's like making fetch happen. They're trying to make Star Trek happen in a way that other franchises happen, but they don't have to do that because great Star Trek has never been reliant upon lots of money. It's very interesting that Star Trek '09, Into Darkness, and Star Trek Beyond were by far the most expensive Star Trek movies. And yet, they didn't ignite interest in the franchise. People liked it. And some people were brought in, so they looked at other... But they didn't become billion-dollar grossing movies. And they didn't substantially grow the franchise. Sure, a lot of younger people who might have liked Star Trek '09 go and look into the franchise that's now been around for 54 years, which is terrific, but there's not the excitement the way you have with a new MCU movie. And unfortunately, we live in a world where studios think that their tentpoles, you spend $200 million, you should make $1 billion. And indeed, they're right. And Star Trek, for spending $200 million on something like Into Darkness, fell woefully short. Didn't even quite make it to $500 million. Because Star Trek is not that franchise. It's never going to be that franchise. And what you have to think about is that the Star Trek franchise should be a good earner. But if you spend $100 million on a Star Trek movie and you make $500 million, that's the world that you should be shooting for. Now, back to Lower Decks. What I see that's happening now with the way Secret Hideout has been managing Star Trek is now a brand. They figure they can throw the name on Star Trek. We'll do an animated show. We'll do a kid show. We'll do a Section 31 show. We'll do a Strange New World show. We'll do all of these shows. But what they're doing is they're diluting the brand. What you need is one show, an awesome show that becomes a water cooler show. The way Game of Thrones was a water cooler show. The way The Sopranos was a water cooler show. The problem is, can you ever do that with Star Trek because it's 54 years old? I think you can. If it's great. If it's great. And that requires a steward of the franchise that loves Star Trek. It requires somebody that has an incredible depth of knowledge of Star Trek, but most importantly, understands what Star Trek is. Because what's interesting to me is that from 1966 to 2005, we knew what Star Trek was. Star Trek was pretty much true to itself. The Berman era of Star Trek from 87 to 2005, remember, he worked with Gene Roddenberry. He was there when Next Generation was being built. And he tried to stay true to Roddenberry's ethos, you know. Well, now, since 2009, we've had a bunch of people that have no fealty to Gene Roddenberry. They want to take Star Trek, and they have been, and try to turn it into something else. They're bringing their spin on Star Trek, but what they're really doing is just diluting it all. Star Trek Lower Decks, I'm going to read a review, not my review, but I would say this. Star Trek Lower Decks is not a show that has its own identity. It's an amalgamation of various other animated formats that we've seen. I mean, like people would say, it's Rick and Morty light, or it's like this, or it's like that. What's really interesting is they didn't start and think, okay, they have an interesting premise for the show, which is one of the things that we've never seen in Star Trek is with at least Enterprise, both Enterprises, the original Enterprise and the Enterprise D, we saw a lot of first contact stories, but the idea that once that's happened, then what? How does Starfleet come in, and then how do you make an ongoing relationship with a new species, a new race of people that you've never met before? What are some of the problems that arise? I mean, to me, that premise is an incredible premise. But this idea that a less important ship or people that aren't as good at their jobs, I would think that people that are in charge of second contact, opening long-term relations, these are people that would have to be even better at their jobs than our own heroes, than Captain Picard or Captain Kirk or Janeway, because establishing long-term relationships and understanding cultural differences, that's really important. So this idea that there's Starfleet ships that are not as good, to me, is a deeply flawed idea. Having a show about second contact, amazing. But the idea that there are Starfleet ships that have crews that are less enthused or less good at their jobs doesn't make any sense to me at all. Star Trek, make no mistake, is an elitist show. It's about the best of the best. It always has been. It's aspirational. It's what we want to be as human beings. And when I watch Lower Decks, I'm like, great, we have to watch another show about people that are less than competent, or they're kind of competent, but they certainly don't act like they're on a quasi-military ship. Where's the chain of command? Where's the sense of discipline? It's a very weird, I think, very postmodern attitude towards Star Trek. And again, we're going to get the same thing with Star Trek Prodigy. Ooh, it's going to be a bunch of renegade kids that find a starship, whatever the hell it's about. But again, you're moving away from the core values of what Star Trek is. Star Trek is about watching the best of the best. Humanity will overcome its problems, and basically we will become an elite society of people that live up to their best potential. And that's not what Star Trek has been about over the last, since 2009. Spock's mad. Spock's dyslexic. Spock now is saddled with all kinds of family problems, emotional problems, learning disabilities. Like, no. that is a fundamental modern reinvention of a character that the point of Spock was that he had to be better than both Vulcans and human beings because he was a man of two worlds and he had to be better than both. That's tough. That requires a lot from someone. But that's what Spock was. Now, modern Spock, all they've ever done is compromised his character over and over again. Star Trek 09. I don't know what Zachary Quinto was playing, but I mean, that guy was one step away from jumping out an airlock because he was so stressed. Talk about lack of emotion. I mean, that guy, it never looked like Zachary Quinto's portrayal of Spock was at all serene. He was barely in control. He was the Spock of Operation Annihilate after the Deneva. They didn't come from Deneva, so they weren't the neural parasites that we saw in Operation Annihilate. When one of them stung Spock, he was in horrible pain, just like the rest of the population of Deneva. And that's what Zachary Quinto's performance as Spock, and I like Zachary Quinto, I like Siler on Heroes, but his performance as Spock was the Operation Annihilate Spock. Spock in constant pain all the time. And I don't know where we're at with Ethan Peck, what he was doing on Star Trek Discovery. I mean, he was only doing what he was written to do, but Mr. Learning Disability, we need to get back. We need to see Star Trek return to its core values. And Star Trek Lower Decks, from my perspective, it wasn't horrible. I didn't hate it. But I thought it was rather average. And you can throw as many references to Star Trek episodes, previous Star Trek episodes, as you want. Jamaron, I mean, great. You saw Captain's Holiday. Ooh, and let's make a sex joke. That's awesome. Good for you. Glad you watched the third season Next Generation episode. That's terrific. But why does your show have to be like, why when I watch it do I think of Rick and Morty? I really would like to watch modern Star Trek where I'm not thinking about, say, oh, I don't know, Game of Thrones, or I'm not thinking about a dozen other things. I'd really like to watch a Star Trek show where I'm obviously watching Star Trek, and that's all I'm thinking about. Now, people could say, well, Rob, you know, the original Star Trek, the original series, was really an anthology show, and a lot of the original episodes were, you know, Balance of Terror, submarine show, you know, things like that. Elaine of Troyes, Taming of the Shrew, Shakespeare. I mean, yeah, that's true. That's true, but it put a unique Star Trekian spin on it. So even though you were watching, and that was a third season episode, Elaine of Troyes, even though you were watching Taming of the Shrew, it was done in a very Star Trek way. So right now, Star Trek, I think, they're taking it in a direction where let's try and conquer all of these different areas, arenas. Now we'll have 2 animated shows, and there's going to be a lot of people that like them, but what we need out of Star Trek is you need to turn it into something where the uniqueness of Star Trek is also allowed to be populist at the same time, which is something I think it can do. Now, there's a very interesting article today that dropped on Deadline, written by Michael Fleming, who is one of the most reputable journalists covering the entertainment industry. I thought this was very interesting, so I'm going to share it with you. This story dropped at almost 1 p.m. today on Deadline, written by Mike Fleming. Emma Watts' top priority at Paramount was figure out Star Trek reboot. Now, who is Emma Watts? Emma Watts used to be the top production executive at 20th Century Fox. She came over with the merger with Disney, and then basically she was phased out. She is one of the savviest production executives, studio heads who's working in Hollywood today. I only met her once. She'd never remember, but I met her at a screening of X-Men Apocalypse on the Fox lot. I was introduced to her, but I've worshipped her and admired her from afar. I think she's very good at her job. So this is what was said, and this is an exclusive. Michael Fleming, again, this was 1 o'clock today. Looks like Paramount's plan to make the next Star Trek movie that Noah Hawley wrote and plans to direct has put on pause for the moment. New film chief Emma Watts, who managed many a franchise at Fox, including, I would say, overseeing Logan, is in the process of figuring out which way to go. The pause on the Hawley project, which had been in soft prep, prompted rumors this week that the filmmaker might exit, but that has not happened yet, sources said. Deadline revealed in 2019 that Hawley made a deal on Trek. The Fargo and Legion EP was driven by his love of the original series, just like J.J. Abrams when he directed the first installment. No, J.J. Abrams was not. He was not driven by his love of the original series, as if you watch any interview with J.J. Abrams that he gave in 2009, he will tell you he never liked Star Trek. He was a Star Wars guy. The other 2 possibilities are the one that The Revenant's Mark L. Smith wrote for Quentin Tarantino to direct. Deadline broke that one late in 2017. I don't know why everyone thinks that Quentin Tarantino was going to direct this Star Trek movie. He never gave any indication that he was going to do that. And another that was going to bring back the original cast, at one time with talk that Chris Hemsworth would return and play Chris Pine's father in a time travel narrative. S.J. Clarkson was attached to direct, but exited for Game of Thrones. What we're hearing is that both the Hawley pick, which calls for a new cast and might be about a deadly virus, which might feel awkward given current circumstance, and the Smith version, Tarantino dropped out as director, but the project is still viable based on an episode of the classic Star Trek series that takes place largely earthbound in a 1930s gangster setting. Oh, great. Might serve the franchise best as a Logan-like spin-off when the core franchise has been revitalized. The other one, the other one, but that the other one might have the cleanest path toward a relaunch with an emphasis on boosting overseas gross numbers, which has never been the franchise's strong suit. These decisions will take place over the next few weeks. Star Trek continues to be a monster franchise for Viacom CBS, so they want to make sure they get it right. One reason the Hemsworth-Pine version stalled is the high price of keeping the original cast in place. Between Fargo and a bookie's completing, Hawley, who made his directing debut on the art house pick Lucy in the Sky, has plenty to keep him occupied. Stay tuned. Here's the thing. At least here's how I see it. I don't think any of these are going to work. They're not going to accomplish what they want to accomplish for the studio. And I'll tell you something. I'll say it. We reported on it. I reported on it last week. The Inglorious Trexperts did a show on it as well. I was on both of those things, obviously, on my show, and I was on the Inglorious Trexperts. I really think that what you want to do with Star Trek is do exactly what a script like Star Trek The Beginning, written back in 2005, owned by Paramount already, written by Eric Jedrinson, the supervising producer of Band of Brothers. They already own it. I think it does everything that the studio wants it to do. It introduces a brand new cast of characters, young people, in addition to having canonical, very much so, canonical fealty to the entire Star Trek franchise from 1966 to 2005, which has been dead in the water. I think they need to go back. Secret Hideout will have nothing to do with this. I think you go back and you find a new group of people that have a fealty to the Roddenberry era and the original Star Trek series from 66 to 2005, and you make that trilogy that's about the Romulan War. It's about a new group of new characters that are very, very likable, and the script is there. All you have to do, and look, it's a first draft. There was never any more drafts done. Yeah, it's not a perfect script, but it's a really, really great script with a great beginning. And I think it's everything that the studio wants to do. But most importantly, you make it for a price. You make it for $125 million. You don't go over that. And you find a director who knows what they're doing, who understands how to use visual effects sparingly and concentrate on the characters. Go back to Star Trek's core ideals. That's what you need to do. It's already there. It already exists. It's a project that could probably get greenlit tomorrow. So, anyway, that's what I would do. And they're dancing around all of this stuff because all of these projects have to go back and reinvent Star Trek from the beginning. You're going to create a new cast of characters, or maybe go back to the Kelvin timeline, which kind of worked, but not really. If you look at the numbers for Star Trek Beyond and actually Into Darkness, they didn't exactly do what the studio wanted them to do. Between Into Darkness and Star Trek Beyond, money was lost. A lot of money was lost. And there's a reason for that. So, anyway, I thought that was an interesting article that dropped on Deadline at 1 o'clock today, that Emma Watt's highest priority is to get Star Trek to come back. You know what you need to do, Emma? You need to find your Kevin Feige is what you need to do. You need to find somebody that understands the Star Trek franchise, not as a business concern, but you need to find somebody that understands Star Trek and make them your Star Trek impresario who will oversee all of these projects. That's what you need. And what you've been doing is you've been finding people that have taken the job because it's very lucrative. It's fine. Secret Hideout, they don't want to give up any Star Trek. They're going to keep making Star Trek as long as they can because they're sucking off CBS and CBS All Access's teat. And they got a lot of money coming in. So their incentive is to just keep cranking it out. What you need is a Star Trek visionary. You need somebody that's going to come in and understand what to do. They have to have a great production background. They have to know how to make something for a price. And you're not going to spend $200 million. What you're going to do is you want to spend $125 million, and then you want to make $500 million. That's what you want to do. That's the way to save Star Trek and make it once more one of the crown jewels in Paramount's theatrical arsenal. this half-assed. I mean, I feel Star Trek has been playing it. It'd be like playing in a Super Bowl game with an injury. That's what Star Trek has been for the last 11 years. It's been limping, and it shouldn't be limping. It should be running flat out, all the way down 95 yards down the field for a touchdown. That's what Star Trek should do. That's what make a theatrical version of Star Trek. Make a $125 million version. Go make Eric Judrinson's script Star Trek: The Beginning. Do the Romulan Wars storyline, and think of it as your Casino Royale. That's what Star Trek needs. It's your Casino Royale. Think of it in those kind of terms. New characters, but yet you've got, what did they do in Casino Royale? They revamped Bond, but hey, they brought back Dame Judi Dench. Yes, they did, to play M. That was kind of a wacky move. You know what somebody would say now? You can't bring her back. No, you got to have a new young hipster M, so the young people will get behind him or her. No, they didn't care about it. Well, Star Trek, you've got Star Trek: The Beginning allows you to bring back many characters. You could bring back Jeffrey Combs as Shran. You could bring back Soval, obviously. Gary Graham can come back. You can actually have Scott Bakula as Admiral Archer. You could do that. It would work. You could bring that back. That's what Star Trek has never really had lately, is having a great film that has connections to classic Trek, or at least the Berman era of Trek, and then moving forward by giving us a whole new cast of great characters, which Star Trek: The Beginning does. Hey, does it need a rewrite? Sure. Never got to that phase, but you already own it. It's already there. Go make that movie. Go make that movie for $125 million. It can be done. You got to find somebody who knows how to do it, but it can be done. Now, anyway, back to Star Trek Lower Decks. To me, Star Trek Lower Decks was... It's so funny because now we're looking at it like, it was all right. It was okay. It wasn't really for me. It wasn't my thing. It's not what I want Star Trek. I want to see something that is not so much a comedy or a send-up or a parody. I think they had a great premise that they just turned into Rick and Morty. Light. And it's sort of kind of a bummer. But it wasn't terrible. And I think that's what we're all like. It was mildly amusing, but I thought of all the reviews that I read of Star Trek Lower Decks, the one in Rolling Stone was the one that I liked the most. Alan Sepinwall, and he gave it 2.5 stars out of 5, which is exactly where I thought it was too. Totally middle of the road. Didn't break any new ground. It was mildly amusing. But let me read what he says. Snarky humor and sincere admiration make an awkward match in the new workplace comedy about low-ranking Starfleet officers. Again, when you're in Starfleet, the idea that lower-ranked officers or support staff on a starship are somehow... You can get drunk and play with Klingon bat'leths and stab your fellow crew members. I mean, all that stuff is so not Star Trek. But anyway, I'll read a little bit of this review. The final season of Star Trek: The Next Generation features an episode called Lower Decks, told from the point of view of a group of junior officers on the Enterprise who see our heroes as their demanding and at times unfair bosses. It offered a fresh perspective on a show that could feel quite tired in its last year, and cast the Enterprise bridge crew in an entirely new light without making Picard and the others seem out of character. 2.5 decades later, the name and concept have been dusted off for the CBS All Access animated comedy Star Trek Lower Decks. It is explicitly set in the Star Trek universe about 10 years after the events of Next Generation and focuses on the lowest-ranking officers on one of Starfleet's least important ships. See, I hate that. Why would Starfleet have least important ships? When you're out on the final frontier and you're a Starfleet ship, there are no least important ships. I mean, that idea is so lame. The USS Cerritos. Brad Boimler, Jack Quaid, is an easily flustered try-hard who doesn't understand why his rigorous rule-following goes ignored by Captain Carol Freeman. Don Lewis, Beckett Mariner, Tawny Newsome, is his spiritual opposite, an improvisational genius with no respect for the senior officers or interest in joining their ranks. Well, yeah, because her mother is one, and so is her father. Rounding out the core quartet are Tendi, a medical officer from the planet Orion, and Rutherford, a human engineer still adjusting to a Vulcan cybernetic implant that occasionally makes him talk about the beauty of pure logic. Showrunner Mike McMahon's love of Star Trek is palpable throughout. maybe a little too palpable. The Lower Decks theme is an entirely sincere, inspiring composition featuring nods to iconic past Trek songs by Alexander Courage, Jerry Goldsmith, and James Horner, among others. Characters are constantly name-checking franchise legends like Khan or Chief O'Brien, as well as deeper-cut topics like the alien sex rite known as Jamaron. The Cerritos security chief is a Bajoran, a primary alien race from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and the series' opening scene has Mariner playing recklessly with a Klingon bat'leth, like the kind Lieutenant Worf used to use in combat. All the references and Easter eggs prove a double-edged bat'leth. They help ground the show in the main Star Trek universe and provide contrast with Boimler and Mariner's comparatively lame adventures. But they also seem to be holding McMahon back from making Lower Decks the wildly irreverent and, more importantly, actually funny comedy it so clearly aspires to be. McMahon is a longtime writer on Rick and Morty, a fact that would be apparent even to those without access to his resume. The primitive drawing style, the disgusting nature of many of the stories. In the premiere, Boimler gets suckled by a giant space spider, while many of the ship's crew members are transformed into zombies with a taste for human flesh, and the general sense of chaos all feel straight out of the Adult Swim series. Rick and Morty was inspired by the relationship between Doc Brown and Marty McFly in Back to the Future, but it's not an actual Back to the Future spinoff, and that makes a huge difference. It doesn't have to be respectful to anything or anyone and can rewrite its own universe rules many times over. Lower Decks, though, isn't off-brand parody, but an approved part of a familiar and revered brand. So whatever satirical elements the new show features about life in Starfleet can only go so far. Now, I'm not going to read this whole review. I'm going to put it in the live chat. But then the entire show seems to be caught in between extremes. It's just over the edge of being too adult for kids to watch. Mariner complains that a Yeti she once met was being a dick, and in one episode gets a punishment detailed to clean the holodeck of what's implied to be semen, but never really delves into truly R-rated Trek content. So, again, what's interesting about these shows is I would love to see an animated show that, hang on, I didn't get that right. I would love to see a Star Trek animated show that is uniquely Star Trek. How do you bring Star Trek into the animated world and at the same time, there's the Rolling Stone review. How do you bring Star Trek into the animated realm, the animated universe, and make it uniquely Star Trek? Again, we're getting a Star Trek property that feels like something else. I would love to have an animated Star Trek show where you would say, by God, that is Star Trek, and it doesn't remind you of something else. Since Star Trek 09, all the Star Trek we have been getting for the last 11 years feels like something else. It doesn't feel like Star Trek, which I think is kind of odd. Everything reminds you of something else, and nothing really reminds you only of Star Trek. And that's what I want from the franchise. I want to see something that is unique to Trek, that it doesn't feel like something else. You know, you look at it and go, wow, now that is, in fact, Star Trek. I mean, what's interesting is The West Wing felt like Star Trek, in a way. Master and Commander felt like Star Trek. A lot of people say Galaxy Quest is the best Star Trek movie since Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. These are things that aren't Star Trek, but they feel like Star Trek. And all the modern Star Trek we've been getting feels like something else. So why can't somebody make something that feels like Star Trek? That's what's strange to me. And I don't know why that is. Now, I want to read an essay by John Scalzi. John Scalzi is a great science fiction writer in his own right, and he wrote an article that I thought it applied to me and my love of Star Trek, and I think it'll apply to you guys and girls and gentle beings and all of you imagination connoisseurs. Again, I won't read the whole thing, but what he deals with, now imagine in this article, he's talking about the canon of science fiction literature. But instead of that, just imagine if he was only talking about Star Trek and how people like me are always talking about what Star Trek is and what it's supposed to be, all of we old fuddy-duddies. And the reason I want to read this article is because this article, I totally agree with this article. I might think about, and I've talked about on the show, the canonical works of science fiction. And I've complained often that people don't have a working knowledge of science fiction as a genre. It's a literary-based genre, and a lot of people don't have that knowledge. However, I don't expect everybody to go back and read science fiction that was written 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. Because what's important is that you're following the science fiction of today, of now, of the pop culture in the world that you exist in here. To expect everybody to go back and I've told everybody, what do I always say on this show? If you were born after Jurassic Park comes out, it's very hard to go back and watch, say, a Ray Harryhausen film, like The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, or Earth versus the Flying Saucers, or Valley of the Gwangi, or one of the Sinbad movies. It's really difficult when you've got things like Jurassic Park. Now, I think that's okay. I think it's always interesting if you want to see how technology in terms of filmmaking has evolved, and I think that there is something to be gleaned from watching these old movies. But that doesn't mean I expect, should you have to watch those things? No. I mean, there's a lot of great modern science fiction being written. There's a lot of great modern science fiction as evidenced on screen that is very valid. But anyway, this article, Oh Christ, not the science fiction canon again. Let's see if there's a date on this. I'm not really sure if there's a date on this, but I wanted to read a little bit of it. Ugh, we're talking about the canon of science fiction literature again for reasons. Most eminently, the recent Hugo Awards ceremony had its fallout, and whether basically newer writers and readers should and must slog through a bunch of books in the genre that are now half a century old at least, from a bunch of mostly male, mostly white, mostly straight writers who are, shall we say, not necessarily speaking to the moment. Now again, plug in Star Trek. Plug in Star Trek. I've essayed this before, but because I'm me. But here's my newest set of thoughts on the matter, also because I'm me. Ready? Here we go. As a practical matter, the science fiction canon is already dead. Now again, I ask you, put Star Trek in there. As a practical matter, the Star Trek canon is already dead. There are at least 2 generations of adults now and 2 generations of genre writers who didn't grow up on it and fundamentally don't care about it. Long gone are the days where a kid's first introduction to the genre was a Heinlein or Asimov novel, smuggled out of the adult fiction section of the library or the bookstore. The kids these days got their start reading the genre through the YA section and grew up on Rowling and Collins and Westerfield and Black and Pierce and Snicket, and got their science fiction through film and television and video games and animation and comics, as much as, if not more than, from books. I repeat, they don't care about the canon. Why should they? What they grew up with was sufficient for what they needed. To be entertained when they became readers and fans, and to be inspired if they became creators and writers. The writers they read spoke to them directly, because the art was new, and it was theirs, not their parents' or grandparents'. And while one might sniffily declare that what those YA authors were doing had been done before, by insert spreadsheet of who did what first in the genre, which is in itself probably incomplete and therefore incorrect, no one cares. For readers and developing writers, it doesn't matter who got there first. It matters who is there now, when those readers and writers are developing their own tastes and preferences and claiming their own heroes and inspirations, both in fiction and in terms of the people writing it. Now, why I find that interesting, and I absolutely believe that, is that Star Trek, for the last, up until Lower Decks, surprisingly, has gone back to the Star Trek of yore. Star Trek '09 went back to Star Trek of 1966. Star Trek Picard went back to the end of Next Generation from 1994, 26 years ago. So, again, we're seeing Discovery predates Star Trek the original series, even though it doesn't really, because it bears no resemblance to that era. So, what Star Trek has been doing has been going back and reinventing things, and badly, I might add, that are from a different era, a different time. Now, Star Trek The Beginning, which, while goes back to the era of Enterprise, later after Enterprise, and the idea of the Romulan War, well, we haven't seen that before. It would be new. The characters are new. They're new, and they're from, while an era in the past, it's an era we haven't yet seen portrayed on screen. Now, one of the big problems I think that Star Trek has had since Star Trek '09 is they've just gone backwards, and they're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole and make us believe in these eras that, well, we've already seen before, and then they're trying to put a spin on it and tell us things are different. But they're not doing anything new, not of today. They're just giving us variations on things, so it feels like Star Trek has been trying to shoehorn, well, modern-day politics, identitarian thought, far-left ideologies, and indeed, we've heard people talk about their agendas. Look, as you know, I've said it a million times on this show, I believe you can't put your agenda before your characters and your story. You got to concentrate on your characters and your story and the stories you tell if you want to have an agenda or try and convey an idea. Well, then do it within the confines of your characters and your story, which means you have to be damn good writers. The original series certainly had great writers. So did Next Generation. So did Deep Space Nine. We haven't seen that kind of writing in any modern incarnation of Star Trek, even though you have a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer like Michael Chabon, writing the stories, which is odd to me. But again, you're going back and treading over well-trodden ground. Here's a news flash. Even though those of us who are old enough for that canon might have some actual relevance to our development as writers, didn't necessarily have that much reverence for it back then. This is by the way, John Scalzi again. Look, I'm 50-fucking-1, and when I was younger, the canonical writers and works were already old. I liked some of them. Heinlein is an obvious one for me, Bradbury a less obvious one, and I enjoyed Piper in parts and Herbert for the length of Dune. But a lot of the rest of them were just not that interesting to me, nor would I consider them significant influences on me as a writer. There are writers outside the field who are much more influential on how I write. Gregory MacDonald and William Goldman and Nora Ephron, to name three, than pretty much any canonical sci-fi writer other than Heinlein. What's more, you could fill a library with all the foundational science fiction authors and books I haven't read, and an even larger one with the writers that I read a couple of things by and went meh and never read them again. Who in genre was influential to me as a writer? Well, in high school and college, and in no particular order, Varley and Bruce and Adams and Gibson and Butler and Le Guin and Card and Gaiman and Stevenson. Alan Dean Foster, who seemingly put out a novel every month, was my go-to guy sci-fi candy as a teenager. Ariel by Stephen Boyette was hugely inspirational to me because it was fun, and it was also written by someone who was still a teenager at the time. At the very end of my formative period came Tepper and Simmons. None of these writers were canonical at the time. Either, well, Le Guin was. They were just who was writing then, putting out new stuff that I would snap up and enjoy. I wasn't spending much time going into the classics of the genre. I wasn't shunning it, but these contemporary writers were just more interesting to me and felt more relevant to my own life. And yes, I know a few science fiction nerds at the time who would try and shame me for not liking some classic writer, or at least someone who they considered a classic. My usual reaction would be to shrug because I liked what I liked, and that was fine. I was, however, more receptive to the enthusiastic sci-fi nerd who, instead of shaming, said, "Ooh, if you like that, then you'll like this," which is how I met Neil Stephenson and Dan Simmons as two examples. The point here is that even for me, who is a straight white dude in his 50s and who is deeply into the middle of a long and unquestionably successful career as a science fiction author, who is indeed, in many respects, the very model of a popular mainstream genre writer, the canon of science fiction, the golden age of science fiction, was not and is not essential. either as a reader or later as a writer. I don't feel bad about skipping a lot of the stuff back then, and at this point, the chance I'll go back and read a lot of it now is pretty damn slim, because I'd rather keep up with what my contemporaries are writing and be influenced by them. Now, I agree with that. I absolutely agree with that. I mean, there's a lot of people. One of my favorite new writers is Charlie Jane Anders. I met her, I think, 20 years ago up at when they used to do WonderCon in San Francisco. Ashley Miller introduced me to her. And back then, she was writing articles. She wrote for IO9. Now she's nominated for a Hugo Award this year for her novel. I mean, would I tell someone like her to go back, you have to go read the canonical heroes from 70 or 80 years ago? Whatever. No. What you do is you want to see people moving forward. But Star Trek is both mired in the past, and you have people that just aren't great writers, great science fiction writers, who are trying to write based on their agendas or whatever. So what we're getting with Star Trek is this weird, not forward thinking. People are going back and they're treading on ground that has been tread before. And it's so strange. What you want to do is you want to give something new to people that also appears to be Star Trek. They haven't been doing that. Star Trek Discovery takes place in an era we've seen, but they want to change it and change things around. So you look at it and go, well, it's not really that era. It feels fake. Modern Star Trek, Picard, this is not Captain Picard. I mean, you can say all you want to change him around, but it's still, he doesn't feel like Captain Picard, which has been the big problem. You've written a show called Picard, and the man you're writing it about doesn't seem like he's like Picard in any way, shape, or form, other than the fact he's being played by Patrick Stewart. And that's weird. Some people like Picard, other people are like, that doesn't really, what's wrong with this picture? I mean, I hated it because it was poorly written, and it dealt with all of its science fiction themes in a very ham-fisted way. As a matter of fact, the themes it was going over were already done much better in Star Trek history. But I digress. Anyway, I'm going to put this in the here's the link to that Scalzi. You can read the rest of it. But I think what's important there, and what the point he's making, is I don't ever want to be some iconoclast that says to these kids, well, you kids, you don't understand. You need to go back and read the classics. Look, on one hand, I always think it's beneficial to understand science fiction is a literary genre. It came out of literature. And I think you need to have a working foundational base. And while you don't necessarily need to read everything, I think having an understanding of where science fiction came from allows you to decide where you want to see it go, or anticipate where you wanted to see it go. And, to me, when Scalzi brings up people like William Gibson, I mean, I remember reading Neuromancer, which was really the first big cyberpunk novel. I think it was 1984 when it came out. That book kind of blew my mind. And then when you found Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash or The Diamond Age, or writers like Dan Simmons who effortlessly moved from horror to science fiction, not only the Hyperion Cantos that he wrote, but Olympos and Ilium and Olympos. I mean, he is an amazing writer as well. But these are people that were putting out books of the day. And I think, as I've always talked about on the show, pop culture has about a 20-year half-life. And people that are immersed in pop culture are most influenced by the pop culture that's swirling around them at the time. Well, when I was growing up, there wasn't a lot of YA books. To me, a young adult book was Roald Dahl. It was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. It was James and the Giant Peach. It was Danny the Champion of the World. And I love those books, just like I love John Christopher's The White Mountains. But by the time I was, 10, 11, 12, I was graduating to mainstream science fiction, canonical science fiction, Dune, or I was reading horror novels like Stephen King's The Stand. There was no YA fiction lasted up until about I was 8 or 9 or 10, and then I moved on. Nowadays, YA fiction is about teenagers and college-age kids, as well as skewing a little younger with the Harry Potter books. So I don't know if that's part of the infantilization of our youth, but whatever you want to call it, it's strange to me that hell, even I read a good article. I read a good review that Stephen King wrote of the first Hunger Games novel, and I'm like, I'll go pick that up and read it. I actually read the first Twilight novel because I wanted to know what the hype was about. Same with reading. I read Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone because that was the first version that had come out. And it just was strange to me that all of those books seemed like variations on themes of things that I'd already read in other novels. I mean, The Hunger Games was like The Running Man, kind of, or it was like Battle Royale, kind of. And it's interesting, but it's of the time. I mean, if you're 10 years old or 11 years old and you like video games and you like genre fiction and you never dealt with something where like kids were getting killed en masse, I believe that reading the first Hunger Games book would have been a mind-blowing experience. And I wouldn't say, well, now you need to go back and read Stephen King's The Running Man, which came out 35 years before you were born or whatever. And what does that do for you? You know, I could have said to somebody after reading The Running Man, my dad might have said, well, you need to go back and read The Most Dangerous Game from like the 30s or the 20s or whenever it was written. That's the story well, that's true. Humans hunting humans. It's been done a lot. You could say that the Australian exploitation movie Turkey Shoot, or as we know it here, Escape 2000. Escape 2000 was similar to the Hunger Games. Human beings are being hunted by a totalitarian regime. Very interesting stuff. So these are variations on themes. Does it matter when you discover them? Do you have to see all of them? Like, if you liked Hunger Games, is it important to go back and read The Most Dangerous Game or see the incarnations of that story in film? Do you need to do that? Or is The Hunger Games enough? I think The Hunger Games for this day and age is enough. You can glean enough from The Hunger Games that you get it. You don't need to go back and you don't have to see every old incarnation. Because The Hunger Games was a really savvily, it was a very well-written update of that theme. So those themes that get constantly pushed down through the ages, The Hunger Games was a respectable version of that. So if that's all you saw, you're okay. The problem that I have with modern Star Trek is going back rather than taking us forward, giving us people new. It's mired in these eras where they keep bringing back older characters that we've already seen their stories, and then they try and change these characters to make them more compatible with today's audiences, which is strange because why do you need to do that? Why not just create new characters? I don't know. It's bizarre. So, I mean, I see with Emma Watts, she's got to reinvent Star Trek for the modern age. Well, what you got to do is you got to find somebody that knows and loves Star Trek, as opposed to all these people that you're trying to hire, like, okay, Noah Hawley. I think Noah Hawley's really talented. I think Fargo's amazing. I liked Legion as well. I thought Legion was terrific. I couldn't believe some of the stuff that happened in that show. You're like, wait, what? I couldn't believe it was on TV. Pretty awesome. Now, what you need to do is find a Star Trek impresario, somebody who knows the franchise, to oversee these things. And it isn't Secret Hideout. Because they're not interested in Star Trek. They're interested in their version of Star Trek. But they're not interested in and they have no loyalty to necessarily, it's a job for them. And because Secret Hideout's the production company, it's not like, I mean, you're kind of working for Paramount and CBS, but really you're doing your own thing. I mean, we need somebody that's at the studio level. There needs to be a Star Trek executive, a gatekeeper of Star Trek. I don't know who that's going to be, but there needs to be somebody like that. And we'll see. I mean, who knows? The other thing that I wanted to talk about today, which is completely unrelated, but we've been talking a lot about whether there's going to be, I mean, Mulan, obviously Disney is bypassing theaters that can't play movies because of COVID-19. But another huge thing happened as far as theatrical distribution goes that could also change the face of Hollywood. And I wanted to touch on that. And a federal judge gave the green light to the termination of the Paramount consent decrees. What are the Paramount consent decrees? Well, this was a ruling that basically made it impossible for studios to own movie theaters, to own distribution. And this is a 7-decade-old ruling. But guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Again, this is from Deadline today at 7:30 this morning. A federal judge has given the green light to the Justice Department to terminate the 71-year-old consent decrees that have restricted major studio control over the exhibition process. The lifting of the decrees will clear the way for studios to once again take significant ownership of theater chains, now in dire straits because of the pandemic. But more importantly for the industry, the elimination of the decrees means that studios and exhibitors will be allowed to engage in a host of business practices that have been prohibited since the late 1940s. Because changes in antitrust law and administration have diminished the importance of the decree's restrictions while still providing protections that will keep the probability of future violations low, the court finds the termination of the decrees is in the public interest, wrote U.S. District Judge Annalisa Torres in a ruling issued on Friday. Read it here. Okay, I'm going to give you that reading. Here it is. I'll put it in the live chat. And I think... let's see. I think it's really interesting to read this. So check it out. There it is in the live chat. Under the plan to terminate the decrees, restrictions on block booking and circuit dealing will remain in place over a 2-year sunset period. Block booking is the practice in which theaters have to take a package of movies in one license. So from one, you have to take like 5 Paramount movies as opposed to individual movies. Circuit dealing is the practice of demanding a single license that covers all theaters in a circuit. The judge agreed with the Justice Department's opinions that the decrees, which had a major role in forcing the end of the studio system in Hollywood's golden age, were outdated in a time of technological change. Torres wrote that 70 years of technological innovation, new competitors and business models, and shifting consumer demand have fundamentally changed the industry. I completely agree with that because of, well, say, television, home video, ancillary markets, streaming, video on demand. All of that has completely changed the whole landscape. She also noted that some of the studios who are bound by the decrees, RKO, MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount, and Fox, no longer exist. Others, like the Walt Disney Company, didn't have their own distribution operations in place at the time and yet are now major players. None of the internet streaming companies, Netflix, Amazon, Apple, and others, that produce and distribute movies are subject to the decrees, she wrote. Thus, the remaining defendants are subject to legal constraints that do not apply to their competitors. She wrote that distributors who are not subject to the decrees have shown no propensity to acquire major movie theater circuits or engage in the type of collusive practices the decrees targeted. She also accepted the Justice Department's argument that existing antitrust law will be effective deterrents against anti-competitive practices. Antitrust laws and their faithful enforcement weigh in favor of the court's finding that there is a low likelihood of a potential future violation absent the decrees, she wrote. In another example, Torres noted that merger laws have changed since the decrees were put in place. A 1976 statute requires parties to larger transactions to notify federal antitrust agencies that they can conduct a review before a deal closes. The National Association of Theater Owners warned of ending the decrees and the impact it would have on consolidation of the exhibition business, while independent theaters argued that nothing in existing antitrust laws comes close to the elegance and power of the theater by theater on the merits mandate that forms the heart of the Paramount consent decrees. Tens of thousands of Americans have enjoyed big screen entertainment solely because of that mandate. Well, what's interesting to me is whether studios are now going to control exhibition or not is sort of moot in the era of COVID-19. I don't think that really studios would want to get into the exhibition business, fraught with peril as it is these days. I think what they want is, like, as everyone pointed out in this article, it's just a different world, and things have changed, and we must evolve and move on. So here we go. I'm going to put this article, if you want to read the rest of it. It's also in the live chat. So yeah, those decrees are archaic, and I believe they should be swept away. But as we all know, exhibition itself, movie theaters are the very idea of going to the movies could be irrevocably changed with the reception of Mulan for Disney. We'll see what happens there. I don't know. What are you guys saying? I have no idea. I'm going to jump in and see what you guys are saying here in the chat. So let's go back down, see who is here. Willow Willow says, speaking of erotic films the other day, have you seen or heard of the Polish erotic drama 365 Days on Netflix? It's one of the worst movies I've ever seen in a long time. Even the sex scenes were irritating due to the stupid songs they play. Well, if Willow is not entertained by sex scenes, then we know it's bad. Because I think she has discerning and out there tastes when it comes to sensuality. So I trust her. Another way I trust her. I have not seen this movie. I want to go there. I don't know if it's a series. I guess it's a movie. I mean, I'll watch it just because you say it's bad. But I have not seen it. I do think, again, we need more erotic thrillers and more erotic content in our movies, which we just haven't. Bunyan Snipe sends in a tip and says, have you seen the 1957 film Hell Drivers? An amazing cast including Stanley Baker, Herbert Lom, Patrick McGowan, William Hartnell, Sid James, Jill Ireland, Alfie Bass, Gordon Jackson, David McCallum, and Sean Connery. It's well worth a watch. I know of this movie, but I've never seen it. I didn't realize that cast was in it. Wow. I'll watch that. Mark C is here. Mark C sends in a super chat and says, I just wanted a Filmation Star Trek The Next Generation. Well, Filmation made, obviously, the 22-episode Star Trek The Animated Series in 73-74, which had a lot of really great stories, I thought. I mean, yes, it was hampered by its small budget, the limited animation, and if many people have pointed out, a lot of the time the cast was not working together, so they were phoning in their performances, and I think that's kind of definitely a bummer. But it would have been nice to have seen an animated Star Trek series like Next Gen. I guess Star Trek Lower Decks is the closest we're ever going to get to that. Julius Goodwin is here. Sends in a tip and says, by the way, Julius, just so you know, we got a box today. Thank you very much, sir. I very much appreciate it. Julius Goodwin sends in a tip and says, you're marooned on a desert island, and you have to make a choice. You can only choose to watch Picard or Star Trek Lower Decks. What do you choose? Well, I haven't seen the rest of Lower Decks, so I'm going to take Lower Decks. Picard, I never need to see again. I've got to take Lower Decks because you offered me the opportunity. I guess I'll take Lower Decks. I mean, I have to tell you, I really, really found Picard a chore to sit through. It just made me angry. So I'm going to take that, Julius. Brendan Sheehy sends in a super chat and says, I just watched the newly released horror Host. It was filmed entirely on Zoom during the quarantine. Very novel and full of scares. You should watch, Rob. I really do want to watch that. I've heard about it. They made it during quarantine, and I'm fascinated to see how that works. I think it's good. I'm glad you liked it. I will definitely watch it. Jagerbomb. Oh man, I could use a Jagerbomb right now. Jagerbomb sent in a super chat and says, the show might have worked if the personnel were enlisted instead of officers. Yet again, Secret Hideout knows nothing of military hierarchy or how to write. Yeah, I agree. I mean, look, I watch a show where Starfleet officers are getting drunk and playing with Klingon bat'leths and stabbing each other. I'm like, these people aren't exactly anybody that I want to follow. They're idiots. I don't like them. I don't want to watch. So, yeah. Sean M. says, so Paramount would have to sever ties with J.J. Abrams. Why would they do that if Discovery, Picard, and Lower Decks are successful? Well, I don't necessarily know. We don't really know how successful they are. Picard and Discovery are two of the most expensive television shows ever made. Did they get enough bang for their buck? I don't know. Look, if Paramount under Emma Watts wants to make a new Star Trek franchise, and she should, I think she needs to move out. I don't know what the deal is, but I would make it without Secret Hideout. I think the best thing for Star Trek now is to make something that has nothing to do with Bad Robot or Secret Hideout. Find a new regime. Find a new group of people to make these movies. And why not? Why not? Competition is healthy. I would love to see somebody come in and smoke Secret Hideout and Bad Robot, make a Star Trek movie for $125 million that grosses $500 million. That's what I would shoot for. If I was Emma Watts, I'm like, I want to make a Star Trek movie for $110 million, or maybe even less. But I think 110 million, concentrate on the characters, and shoot for that $500 million number. I think it can be done. And if they are successful, I don't know. I don't really believe that they are necessarily. Alexander Wilson says, what's your opinion on Viacom CBS's recent earnings? It was very good. Their streaming revenue grew at a good rate. I think everybody's streaming revenue has grown at a good rate because of the pandemic. I just because those numbers are up, I would be curious to see how they survive if the pandemic is over and more people can get back to work. But yeah, I think everybody's streaming numbers are up, so it didn't surprise me at all, to be honest. Jason Whitcomb sends in a tip and says, Rob, Paramount needs a Harv Bennett. He did Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan on a TV budget and made a profit. A Paramount suit once said they loved 1980s Friday the 13th because it cost less than Star Trek The Motion Picture's credits and made more money than Star Trek. I agree. I agree. You need a visionary. You need somebody who is a great producer, who understands how to make something on a budget that also loves Star Trek. That's exactly what you need. And someone who wants to do that. So we'll see. Nick Parrish sends in one of three. What up, Rob? So I don't know if you've read the story of the French cinema owner who tore apart a Mulan display set up in his theater. When I read about this, though, it actually upset me, Rob. The reason why is because when I hear people say, who cares about the survival of any benign business or cheering the downfall of any business, I think about people like the small cinema owner. These are some people's lives, and I've never been more disgusted and shameful of my fellow people's lack of compassion and empathy than during this pandemic. We've proven as a society that unless a problem affects us individually or someone we're close to, that we don't care about another person's physical, mental, or financial health. It's a disgrace. Look, I agree. I think this COVID-19 pandemic has revealed a lot of people for who they are. Selfish assholes. And it's too bad because it shouldn't be that way. And the thing is, France reveres cinema as art, and I saw that clip destroying that guy destroying the I didn't realize it was French, destroying the big theater standee, and what a bummer, man! What a bummer that that happened to him, because I'm sure they wanted to see it on a big screen, and now it probably won't last. I mean, who knows? If he's a small cinema, hopefully he'll be able to continue on. But if he was expecting that money that Mulan was not going to bring him for that cinema, I hope he can continue on without it. Sean M. sends in a super chat and says, to have context on science fiction, you do need to read Foundation and Rendezvous with Rama, at the very least. I like Rendezvous with Rama, and I like the Foundation. Those are great canonical sci-fi works. But I agree with you. There's a lot of other science fiction books I think people should read as well. Alexander Wilson sends in a tip and says, don't forget that Viacom CBS will release their global streamer in 2021. It looks like they will use that as their Star Trek international distributor. That's probably very true. So that's why Star Trek Lower Decks, they're going to use that to entice foreign subscribers. But you're absolutely right, I think. Eric Gant sends in a tip and says, it looks like the fourth JJ vs. Trek film just got canceled, and I didn't even know it was in the works. Yeah, well, no, it was. And as they said, it was in soft prep. So, I mean, I think that means they're developing it, but they don't know yet. But yeah, I can see that. Carlos Fontes sends in a super chat. Thank you very much for that. And says, I read every issue of IDW's Star Trek Ongoing and Star Trek Boldly Go, and I loved it. It was a blast watching Captain Kirk meet Q and go up against the Borg. Ugh. The Kelvin timeline could have been so great. Really, though, Captain Kirk meeting Q and going up against the Borg, like, okay, I guess it could have been. Noodles sends in a tip and says, sup, Rob, Noodles here. Was watching The Sound of Music Elizaviews and came up with a weird take on it. I feel like there are themes tied to paganism. Maria has so much trouble fitting in at the Abbey because she isn't of our monotheistic world. That's really interesting, Noodles. I like that. What if Maria is a musical nymph who wandered too far from the Alps and was taken in by Mother Abbess? Abbess? Her voice is able to influence more mortals. You know what, dude? I wish that I had your take on Sound of Music when I read it. I like that take. I think it's pretty good. That's really interesting. You know what? I'm going to turn that. That's going to be in my head canon from now on. That's who Maria is. That fucking bunk tipped dollar says, Happy Friday, Rob. Just started to get into Lucio Fulci's filmography. So far, I've watched Don't Torture a Duckling. I have a number of his films on Blu-ray on their way to me. What are your favorite of his films? Well, probably, I mean, the first one I saw was Zombie and The Beyond. I mean, those are probably my two, but those aren't unique. Those are also the first two of his I did see. So I'd have to say that's what it was. Michael Preston, I you know what? Report back. It's funny that Don't Torture a Duckling was the first Fulci movie you watched. That's interesting. I want to hear more about your journey through his filmography. So write back. Tell us how you feel about it. Michael Preston sends in a super chat and says, I hated Lower Decks. It was atrocious. Yeah, I didn't hate it, but I just found it to be very ordinary, and I'd seen it all before. I didn't think it was clever, unfortunately. Magic K sends in a tip and says, will you consider to make an audio version of the Robservation via podcast? You know, I did start putting up podcasts of Robservations, and I need to go look into that. I really haven't done much with it, so yeah, we'll see. Torrin Atkinson is here, and he says, you know, I should just do it. I should just bite the bullet. Roberto Suarez offered to help me out with that, and I should take him up on it and get the show out as podcasts every day. I should do that. Torrin Atkinson sent in a super chat and says, my trusted pals who work on Lower Decks say it gets better. Well, I hope so. I mean, again, I sort of object to the way they're presenting the premise, but if it gets better, I will take your word for it, and we will be watching. We will be watching. I have many letters from people, to be honest. I have many letters from people. But since I started so late and I've got exciting things going on, people. Hopefully I can tell you more about it at some point. But there's interesting stuff happening, which is good. Let's see. This letter comes from Stubble McShave. Hi, Rob. After seeing the attacks on Gina Carano for posting a famous picture of Nazis saluting with one circled guy who refuses to do the salute, I recognize something about some of those accusing her. Some of these people are the same type who often, as of late, have tried to tear down and cancel other people who sometimes say something stupid or sometimes actually didn't say anything wrong, as in Gina Carano's case. I recognize some of the type of language being used from when I went to school in my teens. They sounded like when girls were bullying other girls on the schoolyard. They didn't sound like boys bullying boys, but rather the more psychological social terrorizing that's more common amongst immature girls trying to increase their ego by tearing down others. The sad thing is that they've taken an important issue like Black Lives Matter and used that as a moral excuse to get a power high from tearing down other people. Fortunately, Gina Carano is a strong-willed individual who didn't succumb to that type of pressure. I don't know her whole story, but you need a strong sense of confidence and a robust psyche to complete an elite-level Muay Thai and MMA, as she has done. When you bow down to pressure from self-appointed moral guardians who do these things in order to boost their ego, you empower them to bully other people who dare express an unwelcome thought or who may get misunderstood. Free speech is one of our most precious things, and free speech must include the right to offend. If you don't have the right to offend, then you don't have free speech, because whatever you say, someone will take offense from it, even if it's just commenting on the weather. Thanks, Stubble McShave. By the way, you should check out Christopher Hitchens' talk on free speech. He does his usual bashing of religion at the end, but if you're religious, you can still find the first half interesting and worthwhile. Well, Stubble, I will put in this link to Christopher Hitchens. I'm a huge fan of Christopher Hitchens, so I miss him. Let me put it here. So there you go. Yes, I'm a big fan. For those of you who don't know, Gina Carano ran afoul of the Twitter mobs because, first of all, she did post that picture, but I don't think they really understood what that picture meant. But it was basically one man, one German resisting the Nazi salute, and it was for love, by the way. And I don't think they really got that. And how people, what's really interesting is you might oppose the Black Lives Matter movement because you don't appreciate or you don't like the methodology behind that movement. That doesn't mean you're a racist. That means you don't like what they're trying to do or how they're trying to do it, their methodology. And that seems strange to me when I looked into what everything that she said. And if you go back and you look at her social media, there's nothing that says she's a racist. And yet, it was weird to see what happened because people jumped on that and they started calling her a racist. And I think what's really interesting is that, first of all, you need to go back and you need to look at somebody holistically rather than one tweet that you might not quite understand all the context for before you start accusing people of being a racist. And I think that's kind of what happened in this case. And she's like, I love the fact that she stood up to it because she knows I'm Cara Dune. Season 2 of The Mandalorian's coming out. What, do you think you're not going to watch The Mandalorian? Okay. But it's just odd to me that if you want to start accusing people of something, go look at who they are. You have misconstrued it. I say this because it happened to me 2 months ago. I made a very specific tweet that I thought people understood. It was coupled with a video. And obviously, because I feel that if you're following me on Twitter, I've tweeted over 100,000 times. So it's like, if you follow me, you understand where my sensibilities are at. So to take one tweet, if you thought that I was calling for violence against protesters, I mean, it's such a weird thing because what happened to Captain Dorn was not about protests. It just happened under the cover of protests, but it wasn't about protesting at all. People use that as an opportunity. Armed robbers use that as an opportunity. And what I was trying to say with my original tweet was, first of all, I was being sympathetic to a dead black man on the side of the road who shouldn't have died, father of 5, grandfather of 10. And my point was, where was somebody who's talking about the Second Amendment? Where were they to defend this man? And unless you saw my tweet with the video, it didn't make any sense. So once the tweet was taken out of context and they screen capped it and were sending it out, people started calling me a racist and a right-winger. And I'm like, but my words were coupled with a video and you had to see them both together. But it didn't matter. A lot of people piled on me. People that I knew piled on me. So I'm used to, now I understand how that works. And it's really a strange thing. So who knows? Very, very odd. The whole thing is very odd. You just got to be careful. But people who are going out after Gina Carano, why would you do that? What a, I mean, she's part of the community. She's now become a sweaty nerd. So yeah. This next letter, I'm going to take a swig because I haven't eaten anything and I'm feeling my energy wane. Greetings, Rob and all Robservers. This comes from our chairman, Jeffrey Mao. Greetings, Rob and all Robservers, Robservationists, imagination connoisseurs, and members of this, the Post-Geek Singularity. Once again, it is I, the chairman, regaling us all with nostalgic remembrances of how awesome it was to grow up in the 1980s, and to annoy the ever-living crap out of our younger members like Willow Yang, Emil Johansson, and Joshua Levesque, who are probably sick of us old farts once again talking about the 80s. But really, it was an awesome decade to grow up during. Of course, at the time, no one knew any differently because you have no way to have any hindsight, unless you're Marty McFly, as to how great a decade was in which you spend your childhood. I was born in the right year that I was able to start first grade in 1980 and finish ninth grade in 1989. You can't get it more perfectly lined up than that. However, I will say that even though growing up during the 1980s was certainly enjoyable, I don't know that I would have actually liked having to live and work during that time. I mean, it wasn't as bad as other times in the past, but the economy never seemed great. And when it was going well, it was only going well for the greed is good types. And then we had the Wall Street crash, which put the kibosh on that. Times are always nicer when you don't have to wear or make money, when you don't have to wear, when you have to work or make money or pay the bills or the mortgage or put food on your table. When your only worry is getting a good grade on your math test, not getting beat up by the 5th grade bully, and wondering why the school bus is late, it doesn't seem that big of a deal. My family actually did pretty well during that decade. It was during the 80s when my mom and dad really started to make good money. My dad had turned away from being a chemist and entered into a partnership owning and running a mushroom farm in southeastern Pennsylvania. That could be lucrative. He eventually became the sole owner. My mom was an actuary and had worked at insurance companies like New York Life and MetLife before getting a job at DuPont, working in their benefits department. We lived in a pretty rural area, and Wilmington, Delaware was about the closest big city. Then after that was Philadelphia. Due to the times and our location, we only had antenna TV, so I had the usual 6 channels. My parents had a very modest record collection, so I think that because of that, I didn't buy a lot of records at all. I remember the first cassette tape that I got was either Van Halen's 1984 or Quiet Riot's Mental Health. The only reason I remember getting that was the 12-inch picture LP of the Miami Vice soundtrack. I remember the first VHS tape that I bought was Top Gun. The first live-action film in the theater that I saw was 1981's Time Bandits. My dad had taken me to see Dumbo in '79, which I believe was the first animated film that I saw. My parents were, and still are, exceedingly boring in their cultural and entertainment interests. Keep in mind, as immigrants, they naturally did not absorb the cultural offerings to the degree that natives would. For example, we lived in New York in 1977, in that year that has been mythologized nonstop in popular culture, and it seemed like it never affected them. Therefore, I didn't get taken to see many films until I was a little older, starting around 1983. My dad would watch Sixers and Phillies games in the news. I don't recall them liking any shows in particular. That's probably why they had such a spare record collection. They had a few of the 60s and 70s classics, like a Simon and Garfunkel record, but nothing like you would expect from a typical collection at the time. Nevertheless, I did not feel in any way deprived, as I still developed my nerdy and geeky interests during the 80s. But we also know that with good things, there is always the bad. And I won't make the bad stuff about the 80s, only things like, for example, we didn't have the internet, or cell phones or the like, because, well, we didn't. The things that I didn't like about the 80s are merely things that could have been better, but trends or fashions or preferences simply pushed them in the wrong direction. To start off with, clothing fashion in the 80s always gets a lot of hate. And this is debatable. You know, there's a lot of nostalgic acceptance of the goofiness of some fashion trends back then. But if you look at the fashion trends that tend to be the most timeless, the 80s pretty much lacked any of them. I also lump hairstyles in as well. If you abide by the rule that good fashion should make the wearer look more youthful, energetic, or attractive while being as simple as possible, not much from the 80s would have qualified. Also, there were just some things that mystify me now as to why we couldn't figure it out at the time, such as the proper length of shorts and the length of socks. I know everyone has a terrible picture or two of themselves from the 80s with too short shorts and tube socks pulled up their knees. I did. Cars, for the most part, sucked during the 80s. They weren't very fast, efficient, or pretty. Cars from Detroit were still suffering from gas shortages and led to unleaded challenges, and for the most part, cars were intentionally built to be slow and more efficient. Car designs were also pretty lousy as well, with mostly European imports being better. Even cars like the Fox body Mustangs and the Firebird Camaro bodies weren't as fast or as nice as remembered. The Corvette was a bright spot, but it wouldn't be until the late 90s that we got a decent Corvette. Animation, especially TV and Disney, was mostly lousy, even though there was a lot of cartoons that I watched there and liked. The 80s were considered a very down decade for Disney, for sure the first half, and I would agree with that sentiment. I think that Disney had plenty of good animated features today, but in the 1980s it was pretty barren. Television that took advantage of the emerging Asian shops. Television cartoons were even worse, with the predominance of cheaply drawn, mass-produced series that took advantage of the emerging Asian shops that filled in the rest of the frames. I would watch G.I. Joe and Transformers and would hope that the episode was one of the better-looking ones. I figured out, every one out of 4 or 5 episodes was drawn by the good shop and the rest were the crap shop. They probably were saving money trying to get enough episodes out. The very special stock footage episode. There were, along with bottle episodes, a staple of TV shows back then. In order to pad out a full season, you had to have a couple of episodes where they would rely on a lot of stock footage, and it was usually because a character was close to death and the rest of the cast was gathering around reminiscing about a near-dead character. At the end of the episode, the character would miraculously recover with no ill effects. I remember Miami Vice doing this, as the season 2 finale of Next Generation did this. Baseball stadiums and uniforms. This is a personal pet peeve of mine, as the preponderance of ugly toilet bowl-like stadiums with AstroTurf and uniforms with no belts and buttons were all the rage. It wasn't until the late 80s and the increased interest in baseball history and nostalgia, partly fueled by films like The Natural, Field of Dreams, Bull Durham, and 8 Men Out, that we saw new stadium construction tearing down or replacing the old blights, and pretty much every team changing their uniform designs to more classic looks. Well, I could go on, but I'm pretty sure Willow, Josh, and Emil are about ready to admit that this was a bad week to quit doing drugs after listening to me ramble on about the 80s again. So I hope that was fun, and I look forward to hearing other people's remembrances of their wonder years. Thanks, Jeffrey Mao. Well, what a great letter. Thank you for that. I very much appreciate it. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to cut this one short. I know it's a short one, and I appreciate you waiting, but I'm doing a whining about movies tonight. We're doing Rocky. Elizabeth and I will be on here at 7 p.m. Talking about the first Rocky from 1976. So please join us for that. That should be fun. I want to bring this episode number 484 of Robservations, to a close. I'll be back tomorrow doing an epic long version where I'm going to get to all of your letters. The website's back up. You can once again write me at the website. Not entirely all back up, but you can write me and send me letters. I know you haven't been able to do that, but I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank everybody for generously supporting the channel via tips and super chats, but most especially, thank you for writing letters and contributing and being part of this great YouTube community. I think it's great. I have a few questions, I think, that have been thrown at me. So Anonymous sends in a tip and says, I tried those IDW comics too. I gave up when Spock resisted an overpowered Borg assimilation through the sheer force of will. I'm not kidding. Yeesh. Carlos Fontes says, I'm starting a change.org for Paramount to make you the Kevin Feige of Star Trek. Here's the thing. While I could do that job, I don't deny it. I could absolutely do that job. I'd kill it, by the way. I'd kill it. I don't have the professional credibility where a company like Paramount would hire me to do that job. I just haven't done enough in my life. I certainly haven't had much commercial success. And if I had a long... I might be able to sell myself on the job, but unfortunately, as far as the industry is concerned, I don't have that kind of clout. But I appreciate you thinking of me. I mean, I would honestly, I would crush it. I'd knock it out of the park. But I don't have the professional credibility. So it's too bad. But I think I could do it. But I appreciate you saying so. David Rods, 1978, sends in a super chat and says, your Star Trek outline for the future has way too much common sense. They could easily start a new show set a few decades after TNG, DS9, Voyager, and have stars from those series pop up occasionally. You know, I think they could, but the problem is what they want to do is do something new. And the one thing about Star Trek Lower Decks is it's got both canonical fealty to it, but it's also got a brand new cast of characters, of exciting young people. And it deals with being cadets and all that. It's really good. I mean, look, the script is, I would say the script is 75 to 80% there, but it's really good, and it should get made. I hope it does get made. And I appreciate your vote of confidence. All Father Throg is here. Throg Bushimi says, it's time to bring back the to be or not to be. I'm surprised people haven't gone after Mel Brooks for his Adolf rap. Yeah, I know. It's crazy. It is nutty. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to bring an end to the show. I want to thank you for waiting. First of all, waiting, and I'm sorry I'm late. And I want to thank people like Joshua Levesque, Haynock, Robert Pariso, and the Richard is here. Mr. Derringer is also here. I want to thank you all for moderating today. And come back tonight at 7 o'clock where we will be talking about Rocky, the first Rocky, for Romantic Friday. Elizabeth and I are going to share a bottle of wine and we're going to talk about Rocky on Romantic Friday tonight. And again, I'm going to be back tomorrow. I've got a long show to do tomorrow with lots of viewer letters that I have to get to. And if you want to send me one, please go to the Burnettwork.net website and check it out. Also, if you haven't, go to the Post-Geek Singularity Facebook page and the Whining About Movies Facebook page, where the Richard is frequently running watch parties and all kinds of things. It's amazing. And so with that, I will say, remember, every person you meet has a story to tell you have yet to hear. All you have to do is listen. And with that, I remind you, we'll be back at 7 o'clock. I'll be back tomorrow, long-form show, probably at 1. But I will say this. Every person you meet has a story to tell that you have yet to hear. And all you have to do is listen. And with that, I say, have a better day.